Committee. We will call the meeting for Financial Institutions and Insurance for February 9th to order. Are there any bill introductions?
That I hope not.
See none. Okay, we will open the hearing on Senate Bill 78. Eileen, could you give us an overview?
I sure can, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Good morning, committee. Senate Bill 78 updates certain statutes relating to the regulation of the business of insurance, and it grants the Commissioner of Insurance certain investigational powers. Section 1 amends KSA 40-103, which is the statute that outlines the Commissioner's powers and duties. Under current law, the Commissioner has the power to make investigations and examinations pertaining to complaints and related to insurance fraud, and to investigate possible violations of the Kansas criminal statutes pertaining to and related to insurance fraud. Subsections B2 through 5 of the bill would grant the Commissioner the ability to appoint investigators to aid in these investigations and examinations, and in connection with these, the power to subpoena witnesses, to compel the production of books, records, and other documents, and to order that depositions be taken. Should an individual refuse to comply with such a subpoena, the Commissioner would not be able to act on behalf of the department. The Commissioner would be required to apply to the district court for an order to enforce. Section 2 amends KSA 40-201A pertaining to the definition of service contract, and when the issuance, making, and administration of a service contract is exempt from the regulation as insurance. Current law states that the definition does not include an automobile club service as defined in KSA 40-2507. The bill would strike this provision because the bill would also repeal the Automobile Club Services Act. Section 3 amends KSA 2020 sub 40-246I, which is a statute that provides the definitions for the surplus lines insurance statutes. Under current law, the net worth, annual revenue, and annual budgeted expenditure amounts must be met by a person in order to be considered an exempt commercial purchaser, and these amounts must be adjusted every 5 years through rules and regulations. The bill would strike the requirement that the adjustment be accomplished by rules and regs, and instead require that the adjusted amount just be published every 5 years in the Kansas Register. Section 4 amends KSA 40-4,104 pertaining to the minimum non-forfeiture amount used to calculate the minimum values of any paid-up annuity, cash surrender, or death benefits available under an annuity contract. Under current law, the interest rate used in determining minimum non-forfeiture amounts shall be an annual rate of interest determined as the lesser of 3% per annum, and the interest rate calculated as the 5-year constant maturity treasury rate reported by the Federal Reserve as of a specific date, or average over a period rounded to the nearest 1/20th of 1% specified in the contract, no longer than 15 months prior to the annuity contract's issue or redetermination date, reduced by 125 basis points where the resulting interest rate is not less than 1%. That bill would change that last 1% interest rate to 0.15% or 15 basis points. Section 5 amends KSA 40-2205 of the Utilization Review Organization Act pertaining to the conduct and certification of utilization review organizations. Under current law, the Commissioner is required to adopt rules and regs establishing the conduct of utilization review activities that are performed in the state with the advice of an advisory committee that is established by 40-22A05. The bill would strike the requirement of the Commissioner utilizing the advice of the advisory committee, and it would add healthcare providers to the type of utilization review activities requiring the rules and regs be adopted. Section 6 amends KSA 2020 sub 40-2205, again of the Utilization Review Organization Act, And as I stated just a second ago, this pertains to that advisory committee. The bill would strike the portion of the statute that creates the advisory committee. Again, in partnership with the previous section that is striking the requirement of the commissioner needing the advice of the advisory committee. Section 7 amends KSA 2020 sub 40-22A06, again of the Utilization Review Organization Act, which specifies the exemption to the certificate requirement of utilization review activities and states when certification provisions of the Act are not applicable to certain organizations. So under current law, the provisions of KSA 40-22A04 subsections B2 through 5 do not apply to utilization review organizations that are already accredited by and adhering to the National Utilization Review Standards approved by the American Accredited Healthcare Commission or other such utilization review organizations as the advisory committee might recommend and the commissioner approve. Again, since we are essentially dissolving the requirement about the advisory committee, the bill would change that reference to the American Accredited Healthcare Commission to the URAC and strike the reference to the advisory committee. Section 8 amends KSA 2020 sub 40-4103 pertaining to requirements that risk retention groups chartered in foreign states must observe. And according to current law in subsection B1, a risk retention group seeking to do business in the state must submit a copy of the group's financial statement submitted to its state of domicile that is certified by an independent public accountant. The bill would strike the requirement that the financial statement be certified by an independent public accountant. Section 9 amends KSA 2020 sub 44-1704 pertaining to the registration of professional employer organizations. Under current law in subsection E, a registrant must renew its registration by notifying the commissioner of any changes in the information provided in the registrant's most recent registration or renewal within 60 days after the end of the registrant's fiscal year. The bill would extend that 60-day time frame to 120 days. Subsection H requires that an applicant for registration submit the applicant's or the applicant's parent holding company their most recent audit at the time of initial registration and specifies that that audit cannot be older than 13 months. Thereafter, the professional employer organization or that organization's employer group must submit a succeeding audit within 60 days after the end of the employer organization's or the parent holding company's fiscal year. And then similar to the amendment that we just spoke about, the bill would amend this 60-day time frame to 120 days after the end of the professional employer organization's or the parent holding company's fiscal year. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, the bill would amend the Automobile Club Services Act, which is KSA 40-2501 through 40-2513, and I can stand for questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Committee, are there questions of Eileen? Senator Peck?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually have dozens of questions, but I'll limit it to just two from a legal standpoint. I don't know if in statute, I'm looking on page 1 in section 1, well, line 26, make investigations and examinations. We would think common sense would tell us what that means, but not necessarily always in statute does it line up with what we think it should. Is there somewhere that would define investigations and examinations? How would we know what that entails?
I would have to look into that for you, Senator Peck. I'm not sure if there's a specific definition pertaining to the insurance department. I'm sure there is somewhere in statute pertaining to other criminal investigations and examinations, but again, I'm not sure pertaining to specifically the insurance department. Perhaps Lee from the department can speak a little further on that for you.
Right, thank you. And then the last question is on page 2, line 21. Grant any other necessary or appropriate relief as determined by whom? The commissioner? And I suppose it gives wide latitude for the commissioner to determine what's necessary and appropriate. Am I reading that correctly?
No, I'm sorry, Senator. It actually, the last sentence, the last words in line 10 and 11 says the court may. So it would be the determination of the court in enforcing the subpoena or not. Those are actions that the court may take in enforcing the subpoena or order, or the production of documents or books or records.
I appreciate that, and I should have known that because I see that right up above there. But again, that would raise a question I'm not going to ask, but in my mind of what's necessary and appropriate, and I guess it's in the mind of the court. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any additional questions of Eileen? See none. Thank you, Eileen. We will now turn our attention to the proponents. First up is Lee Modisette with the Insurance Department. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Lee Modisette with the Kansas Insurance Department. You have my written testimony. I'll go orally as well, kind of section by section. Starting with section 1, I thought it might be advantageous to explain just kind of the process and why we got here on this. So Chapter 40 has a number of things that the insurance commissioner is instructed to do for protection of the public, solvency, and the like. The intent here with the administrative subpoena it is exactly that. It is an administrative request. Any entity that falls within our jurisdiction already, we don't have any issues with authority in getting that information. What we run into from a process standpoint is kind of two parts. If we're investigating a case of potential insurance fraud, and let's say there's a tow company that has some records that would aid in that investigation of determining whether or not potential insurance fraud was taking place. Currently, under current process, the tow company is not required to give us any of that information because they're not subject to our jurisdiction, and that can create a hindrance to being able to do the things that we are tasked to do in Chapter 40. So our intent here is to actually try to address fraud cases and fraud issues. There are other situations where there are, in fact, there was a story that came out earlier this year where there was an insurance agent who was taking premium checks, depositing in their personal bank account, and not actually using them for those purposes. Obviously, the agent falls within our jurisdiction, but I'm trying to get bank records to determine if they were engaging in inappropriate behavior. The bank does not fall within our jurisdiction. And so we have to, currently, our current process is we work in conjunction with the Attorney General's office to do those. That process works just fine. The intent here is to make that a little bit more efficient for us. As you might imagine, the Attorney General's office, good to work with. They have a lot of other things that they have to deal with as well beyond our request. Banks obviously don't fall within our jurisdiction, so they're not going to provide that information without a subpoena. Keep in mind, too, the administrative subpoena is administrative. If an entity that we were to request information from were to not provide that to us, we would still have to go to court to enforce that subpoena. Having said all of that, from a process standpoint, I wanted the committee to understand that and be aware of why this section was in the statute. We've also heard from some folks who are concerned that they understand our intent. They don't necessarily disagree with our intent, but they're concerned that the language is overly broad. So, Mr. Chairman, if the committee were to decide to work Senate Bill 78, we would request an amendment to pull out Section 1 to give us opportunity to work with all those folks on these concerns. Certainly, our intent here is good in trying to make it more efficient from a department standpoint and continue to do the things that we're tasked with in Chapter 40. We believe this is specific to our authority in Chapter 40, but again, there were some questions about that, so we want The parties that have expressed concern have offered to work with us, and we'd like to do that at another time if possible.
I appreciate that, and just for the committee's knowledge, I do intend to work the bill on Thursday, and I already have asked for that balloon, so no need to duplicate that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Section 2 and 10 relate to repealing the auto clubs. If, again, when the time comes, the intent here is to reduce government regulation and reduce fees to companies that pay these registration fees. It's about $15,000 every other year. At one point in time, maybe the club registration made sense. From our perspective, this is unnecessary. There's no real consumer protection value. Similarly, we have heard from some folks in this space who have said, hey, we agree, we like what you're doing, but we want to make sure that we keep a definition in here, because in other states, when they have repealed this, there have been future regulators who have tried to make these auto clubs regulated like full-blown insurance. That is certainly not our intent. Our intent is to reduce the government regulation, to eliminate it in this case. So we'd like to work with those folks on some, we think would be pretty simple language just to clarify our legislative intent here with this proposal on Section 2. Section 3 is pretty straightforward. The statute already defines what the rate is dealing with this excess lines. It just says that we should publish it, or we should define the rate via rules and regs, but again, statute already defines it. Rather than going through the rules and regs process, we would like to simply publish that in the Kansas Register. It's tied to CPI, and it's adjusted every 5 years. Felt like that would be much more straightforward. Let's see. Section 4 deals with an adjustment in the non-forfeiture rate of annuities. To kind of provide some background on that, the annuity language that's in there is kind of model language that is shared across the states. The NAIC over the summer and into the winter had a long discussion as regulators and with industry about this floor for non-forfeiture rates. There was discussion anywhere from keeping it at 1% going all the way down to 0. Ultimately, the commissioners agreed or settled on 0.15%, and kind of two things related to that. One, this is a floor. It's certainly it's not a requirement. We believe that there will be competitive market and likely in annuity contracts, this non-forfeiture rate will be higher than that, but this does set the minimum. And this would only impact any new annuities sold. The concern from regulators was, given the extremely low interest rate market at this point in time, some companies may experience a solvency challenge if it stays at the 1%, or they would choose to not offer products going forward for a period of time. Nobody believed that was in the consumer's interest in either case. This deals only with a good example would be, let's say somebody has a 5-year annuity and they pay for 4 years. They're going to get their entire investment back plus a percentage. This would set the floor for that minimum percentage back on their money. Sections 5, 6, and 7 deal with repealing utilization review. Again, just trying to explain from a process standpoint what that looks like at the department. The committee that's established here hasn't met since 2015. URAC is already fulfilling, nonprofit already fulfilling kind of the purpose and intent behind those sections of statutes. So rather than having a committee for the sake of having a committee that never meets, we are proposing to eliminate the advisory committee, again, because that function is already happening in other places. And Section 8 deals with an inefficiency with our PEOs. Under current statute, they're required to give us financials every 60 days. That's just not practical. They end up asking for an extension. We end up granting it. So this, moving it from 60 to 120 days for the deadline, just better aligns with what actually happens in practice. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you very much. Committee, are there questions? Senator Hildebrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Lee, thank you for taking out Section 1. That was a big concern I had, but I do have a question for you. I think I understand the reasoning, but I just want to make sure I understand it and I'm not thinking something different. but on page 3, line 43, and then page 4, it has two different places where it's the same thing. But by moving this by the rules and regulations and making it into publication of the Kansas Register by the Commissioner of Insurance, according, if I remember right in your testimony, you're not saying that the insurance commission or the insurance commissioner has sole authority, is the only one that has unilateral to change anything. That's just saying that is reporting the data as it comes in, that data cannot be changed or manipulated. It's just a publication of that data, correct?
Correct, Senator. The rest of the statute actually defines what the adjustment needs to be. So it's just a simple process of letting everybody know, here's what that number according to statute is. Yeah, thank you.
Additional questions? Senator Peck?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Madison, on that very last comment you had made prior to the question from Senator Hildebrand, moving it from 60 to 120 days, do you foresee, or does the department foresee then that there will not be extensions granted?
I don't ever want to say never due to circumstances, but we do not anticipate that this will be a difficult timeline to meet going forward.
So the industry has, when they generally request an extension, you request another 60, and that's sufficient, satisfactory for them?
Yes.
Okay, well, that sounds reasonable to just simplify the process here for the department and for the industry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Senator Gossage?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you mention annuities, thanks for being here, Lee. I'm assuming that's all annuities, limited, fixed, and variable?
Correct.
Okay. And the next question is, you said that the advisory committee is duplicated from elsewhere. What is the elsewhere?
URAC, Utilization Review Accreditation Committee, they already do what this committee used to do. And from a process standpoint, as I understand it, we'd have providers in, they would look at the changes from URAC and usually update our regulation to match what URAC had already adopted. And so from our perspective, rather than have these folks come, take time out of their business and their profession to do that, it just made sense to use what most of the industry uses.
You said that it's not been done anyway. So if it was part of statute, how is it that it was not being done?
Well, the committee hasn't met since 2015 because there hasn't been a need to meet since 2015. Yep.
Okay, thank you. And the other question that I had was, no, it was answered. The extension 60 to 120.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Lee, I have, I guess, a point of clarification. In you and I's discussion, we had talked about removing the subpoena powers, but there's been reference today of removing the entire Section 1. Do you want the entire Section 1 repealed? Or do you just want the subpoena power?
I think removing Section 1 across the board would be better, just to get, there's questions within each section of Section 1 that we would like to have more time, in the interest of everybody's time, to actually flush out and go into detail with those concerns to get answered, yes.
Bad news, Eileen, did you hear that?
I guess I'm going to be redoing that balloon.
Sorry.
No good deed goes unpunished.
I think I'm up to a couple hundred dozen Diet Cokes at this point, Mr. Chairman, so I apologize.
Okay, additional questions for Lee?
Mr. Chair, I can have my questions offline if you want, or I can ask one. I've got two questions today.
Go ahead, Senator Pittman.
Thank you so much. It's really about that. One is about Section 1, and it's more towards Eileen, whether administrative subpoena power, is that a new thing that we're introducing, or is it common across any other organization? But if we're going to probably remove it, we can take that discussion to a later point. So I'll hold, unless you have a quick answer.
Go ahead, Eileen.
I was going to suggest we move that discussion to a later point because I would have to do some research on that for you.
Thanks. That sounds good. The second question is just for the neophytes out here. Lee, on Section 2, could you give us an example of the kind of clubs you're talking about and and what their function is?
Sure. So thank you for the question, Senator. Probably the biggest example would be AAA. AAA has their auto club, and then AAA has their insurance company. We're not looking to do anything on the insurance side. It would be specific to the club side. These are oftentimes discount clubs or sort of member benefits, things of that nature.
Thank you.
Additional questions, committee? Senator Gossage.
Thank you. On the same issue that Senator Pittman raised, I'm trying to understand, it looks like that you're striking service contract does not include an automobile club services. So I'm trying to understand the double negative.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Senator Gossage. And part of the language that we'll want to work with committee on, if permitted, is the reason for this language as it is to make sure, because it's connected to other sections of statute that we're fully repealing. This was defining auto clubs as not insurance and not subject to all the insurance laws, statutes, regulations. And so if we're repealing the registration requirement, from our perspective, there was, we're completely doing away with this as a regulator, didn't see a need or make sense. The concern that we heard from a couple of folks in industry was they understand our intentions, they're supportive of our intentions, but they've actually ran into situations in other states where if you don't define it as not insurance, they've had regulators say, well, if it's not insurance, then it is insurance and we're going to regulate it. And that is not our intent. We're trying to reduce the regulation. And likely that we would want to add some language here that makes it clear that essentially bringing service contract back in and defining what is an automobile club, which I believe is in 2502.
Okay.
Yeah.
That would be a good idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Lee, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, let me call your attention to a proponent written-only testimony by Liz Pujols with Insurance Retirement Institute. Are there any additional proponents? Seeing none, we will turn our attention to oral opponents. We have Bill Snead virtually with AHIP. Welcome to the committee, Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My testimony will be very brief. I'm one of the hooligans that beat up Lee since the bill's been introduced. We appreciate the department agreeing to take out Section 1. That's our concern. We understand what they're trying to do. We just think it needs to be fine-tuned, and we can work on that together. So with that, my client takes no position on the bill if Section 1 is removed from the bill. Happy to stand for questions.
Any questions for Mr. Snead? I see none. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Let me call your attention to neutral written only testimony from Marley Carpenter with ks.gov. Is there any additional neutral testimony? Is there any opponent testimony? Seeing none, we will close the hearing on Senate Bill 78. Committee, I will work with Lee and we'll try to get some language on the auto clubs. And then once again, I said I will get the amendment finalized on removing Section 1. My intention is to work the bill on Thursday. Tomorrow we will have budget hearings once again on the State Treasurer's Office and PMIB Board. With that, we are adjourned.